Before we get started with this episode, let me point out the obvious. It's the gift-giving season. But what isn't so obvious is that you can get your gifts and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner, and whatever you get during that visit, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So get your Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, and Festivus gifts through our Amazon associate links. It's a smart way to shop, and you'll be helping out the show.
Happy Hanukkah to you and yours.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Jon Morris. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this interview episode, I have a great conversation with Jon Morris. His book, The League of Regrettable Superheroes, came out earlier this year from Quirk Books, and we have a great conversation. It's a lot of fun. But before we get to that talk, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you're going to find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off of the cover price, but often the discounts can be more impressive than that.
And the December bundles are impressive as well. We have a Vertigo bundle, which has the 11 newest Vertigo issues for 50% off. We also have a Valiant bundle with the 7 newest Valiant titles for 50% off, and even more bundles that you'll have to go to the website to discover.
That's right. And that website is dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Andy, I had a great time talking with Jon. His book, The League of Regrettable Superheroes, came out earlier this year, the very first part of the summer. I remember getting a copy right before I left for Charlotte for Heroes Con, and I had wanted to talk with him earlier on the show, but one thing just got in the way after another, and we decided to wait until the end of the year because this is a great holiday gift for the comics fan that you love, or it doesn't even have to necessarily be a fan of comic books, just pop culture. This is a great book, and I have a good time talking with Jon about it.
Well, I'm very interested to hear it. This book is on my Christmas wish list, so maybe I'll get it. But in the meantime, I want to hear what you and Jon talk about.
Well, let's give that conversation a listen. I'm pleased to have as a guest on the Comics Alternative, Jon Morris. He is the author of The League of Regrettable Superheroes, which came out earlier this year from Quirk Books. Jon, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Now, one of the things that I want to start off with is by mentioning this book came out, I think it was late spring, correct?
June 2nd, I think, is the specific date.
Okay, so early summer, and we had thought about having you on the show then, but then at one point you and I were corresponding and thought that it may be better to hold off for this in time for the holidays.
Yeah, we'll try to get a good Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Festivus rush going.
Yes, especially the Festivus rush, because that always does something for me. But, and I want to say, and I said this off the air to you, I'm not schmoozing here. I'm not just trying to, to lay on the honey. This has to be the most enjoyable book I've read all year in terms of laughs. I have laughed out loud reading this book. My family sometimes have thought that I may be a little off base, but it is really enjoyable. And this would make the perfect holiday gift for not just the comic fan in your life, but for anyone interested in pop culture and just a good chuckle.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very flattering.
So, to encapsulate what this book is about to the uninitiated, how would you do so?
I like to use the tagline that this is a list of 100 of the weirdest, the wildest, and the straight up most wackadoo superheroes who have ever actually been legitimately published in comic book history. And that's a line I often have to re-underline and recross because folks don't often believe that these are actual superheroes who were given a chance at one point or another.
So you emphasize the actually published. Did you come across any that were not professionally published?
Oh, there are
that you wanted to include?
No, not that I not necessarily, because so many vanity press comics or, say, for instance, web comics or zines or anything that wasn't in the actual distribution market is so often done by a very eager amateur. I thought it would be churlish to include some of them in the book, even if just in terms of quality they sort of belonged.
Yeah, and in fact, in one of the later entries, Thunder Bunny. You mentioned that he got a start in the fanzine world and then made his way into Charlton.
Yes, he got started off in Charlton Comics and then bounced around with a few other small press publishers during the big boom in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Now, the way that this book is arranged is in three parts. You have, in the first part, the Golden Age heroes, then the Silver Age in the second, and then you wrap up with what you're describing as the Modern Age, and you have a note there that basically what you're doing is kind of conflating, more or less, the Bronze and Modern. But you basically begin with the Modern in 1970. That
right.
Really makes sense to me. So you have a three-part arrangement for this, and probably unsurprisingly, the majority, or almost half of the book, let's say, is taken up by Golden Age heroes.
Right. That's in part due to just the wealth of characters that was available during the comics' first boom, and also because there were no rules back then, and you weren't trying to necessarily copy anyone except, say, Superman. So you have some of the wildest ideas that have ever been introduced in comics.
Yeah, one of my favorites, just because it freaks the hell out of me, is the Eye.
Right, or sometimes the detective eye, as if to differentiate him from all the other eyes.
Now, describe that superhero.
The Eye is an omnipotent, omnipresent, floating, flaming giant eye who, despite possessing apparently tremendous godlike powers, insists on using human beings as his intermediaries in fighting crime. So he will show up in the dressing room or in the living room of some poor sap and charge them with the task of beating back a villain or stopping a saboteur ring or some other kind of evil. And then typically he'll let them do all the legwork and then just show up at the end to burn somebody alive. Once they've done all the hard work of actually catching the crooks in the act, the Eye will come in and deliver some sort of vengeance.
Yeah. Another one that I find particularly disturbing, and I think a lot of people would, is the Clown, another Golden Age superhero.
There's an interesting trend in comics to turn both heroes and villains, or create both heroes and villains out of clown motifs. And looking at this, I'd say there probably are 100 different good guy and bad guy clowns in comics, easily. This one I think is interesting because he skirts the line. He tries to be a criminal clown in order to fool crooks into not realizing that he's actually an heroic clown. which might be an extra step of identity that's unnecessary. But yeah, he's a district attorney or an assistant district attorney. I think actually just the DA. It's hard to remember because so many superheroes are assistant district attorneys, which you would think you would vote for or against. But he comes from a circus family. And frustrated by the amount of crime that's overwhelming his city, he decides to return to his roots and fight crime as a clown.
Which some may feel is ridiculous. Well, actually, it is.
It is.
But you know, when you set him next to another one of the heroes that you discuss in the book, Funny Man, and then realize that Funny Man was created by Siegel and Schuster, of Superman fame, then it may not be that weird.
It's certainly not uncommon anyway. Off the top of my head, I believe the clown precedes Funny Man. This is unfortunately not something I've memorized, but yeah, that even Siegel and Schuster would tackle this kind of, let's say, alarmingly different approach to superheroing. Seems to indicate that it has some kind of legs. It gets an endorsement from the two men who created the genre in any case.
Yeah, and in fact, I've read a number of Funny Man strips, and even though it's a little strange, I think it's pretty darn well done. I
love them. I think there's a lot to be said. Siegel, of course, has a really deft touch with creating a romantic but confrontational relationship between two characters, which he did with Superman and Lois Lane, and he does with Funny Man and his manager in the course of the book. And something Siegel never really got to exercise in Superman, strangely. He did not create a lot of supervillains for Superman to face. But he does create, I guess maybe not colorful villains, but colorful wannabes to other clowns who try to usurp Funny Man's status as the prominent clown superhero in town.
Mm-hmm. And plus, Funny Man was drawn to look like Danny Kaye.
Right. It's very obviously inspired by Siegel's love of film comedies and musical comedies.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you about your familiarity with these comics, but, for instance, how many of them did you digest before writing this book? But before that, let me step back and just ask about the genesis of this project. I mean, how did this idea come to you to write a book based on, as you call them, regrettable superheroes?
Regrettable is a term that my publisher chose, and we had to really work around that one because if you read the foreword, you know that I go to a great length to qualify the term, to say that it's not the heroes themselves who are regrettable, but rather sometimes their circumstances or the fact that they didn't get the popularity they deserved or such. But I've been writing about them since the late 90s on a blog called Gone and Forgotten, which I'm not sure how many other prominent blogs there were at the time writing about the same matter. I know Sean Baby preceded me, but I'd been at it for quite some time, and I was basing it on really the collection that I grew up with because both my parents had read comics since they were kids. So I grew up in a house full of just weird and forgettable characters from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, as well as all the ones from the 70s and 80s when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm. So what, in your household, you had issues of Invisible Scarlet O'Neil lying about?
We had, the ones I most remember we had were several issues of Uncle Wiggily, which was a comical rabbit. I'm not sure which of my parents owned that one. I'm inclined to say my mother, but it's just as easily my dad. But we had a lot of the old Captain Marvel comics, a lot of the Fawcett comics. So I was reading about characters like Golden Arrow and Ibis and Bullet Man, Minute Man, characters who weren't quite as famous as Captain Marvel, but they were in those books as well. And a lot of old Looney Tunes and a lot of works from the 60s, including my father's favorite, which was Challengers of the Unknown.
Mm-hmm. So you had a lot of these when you were growing up. In preparation for the book, and then before that, in working on your blog, how much research did you do, and how would you do that? I mean, would you go bin diving in various events or shops? Would you go to any kind of archival library and look through their collections?
A little bit of each. Obviously, growing up with two comic collectors, I had my own collection and got rid of it I think it's about 12 or 13 years ago now. But the last time I counted, I had 15,000 comic books that I had to keep in a storage unit because there was no room in the house for them. Plus, all through college, my roommate and I, especially lacking money as you tend to be in college, we would take every Saturday. We'd take $5, go buy the biggest Coke we could buy at the nearest convenience store, play Black Tiger 1/4 each, takes about an hour, and then spend the rest on comics from a 10-cent bin at the local used bookstore. And so we were coming home every Saturday with grocery bags full of comics. And that just loaded them up. Plus, I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Arizona, which has a great special collections department that includes a number of rare comic books from the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So I was reading up on them way back then. And then in researching the book, just did it all again. Started haunting the 10-cent bins, going back through my own recollections and what books I'd saved, and sometimes doing reference checks either through reprint volumes or even just contacting folks I knew who had the books so I could borrow their copies.
Mm-hmm. I mean, did you have to seek out many other collectors, or were these already friends of yours?
Already friends of mine. Mm-hmm. Luckily, that's one of the nice things about comics is, as a hobby, is that you have no shortage of people who share your interest.
Even in these kind of comics?
Yeah, I'm kind of running a short supply necessarily of people who are super, super in to Bozo the Iron Man, but
oh god.
You can find – the other thing is that there's 2 or 3 great resources online for public domain comics. And I was able to dive into the Digital Comics Museum and into Comic Book Plus, which has scanned copies of, I think, thousands of Golden Age books.
I was wondering about that. And I know that in the acknowledgments page at the very end, you mentioned some of these sources as well as the people that helped you out. The vast majority of these comics are more obscure than otherwise. And so I was wondering, even at those public domain sites, how much of this would have been available?
Quite a bit. I mean, luckily, among a certain breed of collector, when you have something that is lesser known and lesser celebrated, you take a great deal of pride in introducing it to the public. I just recently, and I feel bad about this because I've been using their archives for 2 or 3 years for just my own pleasure and for researching the book. But I just recently scanned and uploaded my own first public domain Golden Age comic to the Digital Comic Museum. And I was excited to do this because it's a book that had not been put up there before. It was a Hoppy the Marvel Bunny story, the rabbit equivalent to Captain Marvel. And it was the only story where he faced the rabbit equivalent of Black Adam, a character called Captain Black Bunny. And the creativity was at a premium, obviously, in naming the characters. But this story existed nowhere else as far as I could tell. If you are into, I guess we'll call it Shazamicana or Captain Marvelicana, and you want to really explore the rarer edges of the mythology of the character, of the publishing history of the character, this is a real good outlier. This is something very few people have heard of, and I was so happy to share it with anyone who cared about it.
Now, we've talked about some of the heroes that you have included in the book, but what I want to do is I want to find out which one of these may be your favorites in each of the 3 parts. And so, okay, if we start with the Golden Age, and this may be like asking a mother, which is your favorite child? But in the Golden Age, which heroes really stand out to you?
I have 3 in the Golden Age that I adore. If you'll indulge me.
Oh, sure. That's why you're here.
The first one, I'm sure most people who are moderate to higher comic book readers have probably met before, and that's the Red Bee. And the Red Bee is Assistant District Attorney Richard Raleigh. He's frustrated with the crime wave that's overwhelming his city. So in addition to his duties as an Assistant District Attorney, he dons a diaphanous blouse, stripy tights, and a domino mask, and launches into action as the Red Bee, armed only with a gun, and in a secret compartment in his belt, a single trained bee that he has named Michael. And if you're wondering what a single trained bee can do to fight crime, he can A, distract enemies by buzzing around their heads, B, sting enemies, apparently repeatedly, or there's a lot of Michaels, or C, on one occasion, when the Red Bee was tied to a chair, Michael got 2 other bees to help him carry a razor blade from a nearby table to bring to the Red Bee so that he could cut his bonds and continue to fight crime.
Well, in terms of stinging repeatedly, it's a good thing that this is Michael and not Michelle, because otherwise the barb would pull it out and she would die.
She would die right there. So there's few superheroes that have done so much with so little. I really appreciate that character.
Yeah. And one of the things I love about this book is, in addition to the write-up, and sometimes they're just one page, sometimes you go on for 2 or maybe even 3 pages, you give other information about their first appearance and who created them, and then 1 or 2 interesting, humorous observations. And so you pointed out that this one debuted in Hit Comics in 1940.
Mm-hmm.
So Red Bee is one of your favorites from the Golden Age. What's another?
There's a pair of characters called Nightmare and Sleepy.
Oh, yeah.
They are homeless journeyman wrestlers who stumble upon a crime-fighting career because they are going to I'm trying to remember what it's called exactly because it's such a strange word. They're going to a party that is being held to honor the best wrestlers in the business. So these days we'd call it the WWE Hall of Fame ceremony, but I believe it's called the Champions Ball in the book. And so they dress as, respectively, Nightmare. One of them wears a phosphorescent skeleton costume, and Sleepy, which is like a baby version of the Grim Reaper. And then they find themselves going into battles with the battle cry listed in the book. You see, first you get Sleepy, and then you have a Nightmare. Possibly the worst battle cry of all time. But the thing I like best about them, besides their adventures are really weird, and they've got a great look, and probably the most unique alter egos in comics, the thing I like best about them is that Bob, the secret identity of Nightmare, is the wrestler of the two. Sleepy is his manager. And when he wrestles, he's one of those gimmick wrestlers who wears a tuxedo in the ring. And I'm blown away that at no point did they think of just combining the 2 costumes and having a millionaire skeleton who fought crime.
Now that would be really cool.
That is top of the field. That is a brilliant idea. I'm embarrassed that they never did it.
Yeah, I'm looking at that entry right now, and Nightmare and Sleepy debuted in Clue Comics, and it was put out by Hillman Periodicals in 1941, and that's also very useful for those who may not be well versed in comics history, because the vast majority of the publishers, especially in the first half of the book, are no longer around. Oh yeah,
they're the fields of comics are littered with the dead corpses of quite a few publishers.
Mm-hmm. And also another thing I really, really enjoy about this entry on Nightmare and Sleepy is the page that you've chosen to include as an example is, I guess, the first page of the story where the villain is the corpse that steals living men's faces. And so you have in the background Nightmare and Sleepy, and then what seems to be somewhat in the foreground are 3 men whose faces are floating away and they're running after them.
Yep. That's a pretty typical Nightmare and Sleepy adventure.
Yeah. And, that sounds weird, like very weird, I'm sure, to our listeners, but It is weird. It
is weird.
When you read about these in your book and all of your entries, and then you see these images, you just it's almost as if you have to shake your head and wonder if you read that correctly or for what you're seeing is actually true.
That's one of the great things about Golden Age comics that makes them so appealing is that they adopt the internal supernatural logic of a fairy tale. And that when you have a hero who dresses like a skeleton and he's fighting someone who like literally steals faces, or he's got a great foe who is a 9-man evil baseball team. It follows the logic of these magical occult stories where anything is literally possible and everything is a distorted form of humanity in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. So what's another one of your favorites from the Golden Age? From
the Golden Age, finishing the trio of my favorites is Mother Hubbard, who is a legit witch. She has the peaked cap, the green face, flies around on a broom, lives in a swamp. The only nod to her nursery rhyme origin is that she keeps concoctions in a cupboard that are all horrible, like bat's eyes and frog livers and all the other terrible things you would imagine a witch from a Shakespearean-style witch might use. And her foes run the gamut from Nazis to giants who eat babies or gnomes who steal the eyes from children.
In fact, this is one of those entries that you devote a good amount of space to, because we have, I'm looking at it, definitely 2.5 pages of images here that point out just the weirdness and also the violence. And this is something that you point out in the entry for Mother Hubbard, is that with a lot of these early comics, these are the kind of things that got Wortham and Company a little riled.
Yeah, these are definitely the kind of gruesome images that stuck themselves in Wortham's mind when he was writing his original text on the problem with comic books and such. I don't know that he was Mother Hubbard in specific, but the field was really invested heavily, especially on its fringes, with just grotesque levels of violence.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm looking at the page with the gnomes that steals kids' eyes, and oh god, I mean, they are as creepy as hell.
It is terrifying. It is all, and there's no character in the book that I wouldn't want to see come back in some fashion or another. But Mother Hubbard absolutely tops the list. I think the right writer and any number of right artists would do an amazing job on it.
That's something that you point out in the introduction, and that is the fact that some of these actually have gone on to get a second or maybe even a third life. Even currently, I know that by the time that you were writing this, Squirrel Girl was already announced, because you point out that Squirrel Girl is slotted for a new incarnation in 2015, and that is many people's favorite comic right now.
It is, and I was lightly abashed when it was announced because the artist on it is my friend Erica Henderson. So I was not aware she had been slated for it, and was hoping she wouldn't take it personally. But it really is it's a fun comic. It's a great one. I was very flattered recently when Erica asked me to contribute a little art to it, in fact.
Great. And then there are others that have seen new life, and one of those from the Golden Age is Kid Eternity.
Yeah, they give Kid Eternity a run every now and again, but they are really running out of time to think of what to do with them, because there's a clock on Kid Eternity. 75 years from the moment of his death is all the time he is allegedly to get, and that wraps up in 27 days.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm sure they'll ignore it. But
yeah, they'll miss the boat on that.
Which is a shame. It would have been fun to have a real-time series that acknowledged that time frame.
Maybe they'll bring back Captain Tootsie.
I am shocked that they haven't, to be perfectly honest. I think actually MAC Cosmetics might have done a Captain Tootsie limited edition. I may have the brand wrong, but I know that there was one major high-end cosmetics company that was doing a lot of classic candy-themed makeups and such. My wife drags me to Sephora a lot, so I know a lot about makeup. And they had a Tootsie Roll section that had a lot of Captain Tootsie art on it, which I think is probably the first Captain Tootsie merchandise in 50 or 60 years.
Okay, well, I'm glad you explained that because I was wondering of the connection between candy and cosmetics. Now we should point out that Tootsie, or Captain Tootsie, started off as a hero for Tootsie Roll, and you would see him in Tootsie Roll ads in older comics, but then he eventually got his own title.
Right, he got 2 issues of his own title and went from defending democracy with candy to defending democracy in outer space.
Because space and candy go so well together.
I think maybe it was the other way. I think they probably realized we've got, I think one page is about as far as you can go with defending candy. And so they had to find the biggest image they could, or the biggest stage they could put him on in the interim.
Mm. Well, Captain Tootsie is not the only corporate mascot that you have in this book. Right. Another one that I found, and I'm maybe jumping ahead a little bit because I do want to ask about the Silver Age comics, is AAU Superstar.
Superstar.
Yeah.
I think he's got 3 or 4 appearances in comics from the 1970s, and they're delightfully pun-heavy, where he battles villains like the Sinister Soul, with the power of his missile toes and just awful, nothing but foot-based puns. The Dirty Sneaker. I was trying to remember the name of his hobo villain, and it was the Dirty Sneaker.
Yeah, and of course you got to have a hobo villain.
I wish there were more. I am very much an advocate of more hobo superheroes and more hobo villains. An entire field would be amazing. They really just represent the tip of the iceberg. When we first put together the roster of possible characters to go in the book, there were about 1,000. And no small portion of them were superheroes who only ever appeared in advertising. So we had, you might know Volto from Mars, who was the spokesperson for Grape Nuts in the 1940s. And Grape Nuts would recharge his Martian powers with which he could dynamically attract items with one hand and repel them with the other. Powers that don't really seem to have anything to do with Grape Nuts, but whatever works, I guess.
Yeah, because when I think of Grape Nuts, I think of magnetism.
Yeah, I think of magnetism and the fourth planet from the sun, and none of that.
Yeah, although some may argue that Grape Nuts has the feel and the hardness of little shards of metal.
This is also true. It tastes like alien rocks, maybe is what they were trying to say. But there's him. There's a Bazooka. Before Bazooka Joe was created, they used to have a crime-fighting kid who would chew atomic bazooka gum and gain the power of flight, and I believe he was assisted by elves in his war against saboteurs and crooks. And I think that's possibly one of my alternates that almost made it in, except for Captain Tootsie. But you can't give up on Captain Tootsie.
Yeah. Now, 2 heroes that you have in the Golden Age are creations of Fletcher Hanks, and some of our listeners may be familiar with Stardust the Super Wizard because of the 2 books that Fantagraphics published a few years ago, and you even make reference to that. So, they may know about Stardust, but they may not know Phantoma.
I would hope that they would avail themselves of both of the books that collect Fletcher Hanks, I believe, his entire catalog of 1940s. That's as far as he was alive. Comic stories from the 1940s. But yeah, Phantoma being his twist on the jungle goddess type character, which was a vibrant subgenre all its own in comic books. Mm-hmm. The difference being that where every other jungle princess was running around in a leopard print onesie or a bikini and had powers limited to, say, talking to tigers or commanding monkeys or something like that, Phantoma was a beautiful blonde woman running around in a black cocktail dress who would turn into a giant, muscled, blue-skinned, skull-faced figure whose powers were limitless as long as she was coming up with some kind of horrible vengeance for her enemies.
Yeah, and this is where things get back to the violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost the weird thing about a character like Phantoma or the works of someone like Fletcher Hanks is that the violence is so almost comically absurd that it's hard to feel the same visceral reaction to it that you would feel for something like in Mother Hubbard, a gnome sticking a crowbar into a child's eye.
Right.
Right, which is that's gruesome, and you have a way of connecting to it. In Phantoma, at one point, she turns some evil poachers into giant grasshoppers, bearing in mind that Fletcher Hanks didn't seem to know what grasshoppers looked like, so they just sort of turn into blades of grass / insect. But it's such an abstract thing that it's tough to really feel that same visceral reaction to the violence.
You know, I think you can make the case that for, Hanks as well as for the character, Mother Hubbard and similar older comics, that the violence there is less objectionable than 1990s comics with, the hyper violence that was all the rage.
I think you're definitely right, because when there was violence in these older books, there wasn't a lot of lingering over it. The violence was considered sufficient unto itself. So you would have maybe Phantoma would burst somebody into flames, but you wouldn't get that on a splash panel. It would not be a full-page illustration. You wouldn't have shots of the hero lingering over the dead body or, running someone through with a knife and then taking 2 or 3 panels to do a kill phrase or a pun or just to mutter something tough. They would just perform the violence, move on to the next part of the story, because that breathless storytelling is what you were really there for.
Mm-hmm. Now before we leave the Golden Age, there are a couple that we haven't mentioned that really stand out to me.
Sure.
And this is in addition to the Clown and Detective Eye, or the Eye. In fact, these come one right after the other in your book, and that is the Puppeteer and then Rainbow Boy.
Oh, Rainbow Boy.
Now the thing about the Puppeteer, as you point out, that the only connection between the hero and his name is that in his civilian life, so to speak, he does make puppets, but there's nothing about his costume, there's nothing about his heroic antics that suggests puppeteering at all. Right.
In fact, as far as superheroes go, he basically, his primary power seems to be revealing his secret identity, which is the worst possible power. I'm trying to remember if this got into the book, because a lot of things were trimmed from it, but a lot of characters were repackaged and rebranded and printed by different companies. So, like, for instance, one of the characters in the Golden Age section, the Black Dwarf, was reprinted and recolored to be the Blue Monk under another company.
Oh, yeah, you did mention that, yeah.
And the Puppeteer is one of those. He was repackaged as a different character. I want to say his name was Major Victory, but I might be wrong on that. But he was repackaged as a patriotic character, but as near as I can tell, not first. He was the Puppeteer to start with. And then they went for the Major Victory thing later.
Yeah. And then we have Rainbow Boy, and appropriately enough, some of the fonts that you use on this page are rainbow colored.
Mm-hmm.
To really underscore the sheer joy that is Rainbow Boy.
He's such a delightful character. It's hard to imagine. I couldn't possibly imagine a character like this debuting today, especially with his origin, which is literally that he sits in his basement experimenting with light and then just comes out with powers.
We should all be so lucky.
I've experimented with a lot of things in a basement and never come out of them with powers, thank God.
Yeah, I know. That could get a little weird.
But, yeah, I mean, everything about him, his career, he's a teenager, so he doesn't have much of a career, but his career is that he's a radio whiz kid, which is apparently, I learned in some casual searching, a real fad in the 1940s, were these radio whiz kid programs where you would have some very smart youngsters on there just trying to answer any question that was put to them by the callers.
Yeah, and he debuted in Regular Fellas Heroic Comics in 1942.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a heroic comic. Heroic Comics, I think, was the later edition. Regular Fellas was an ongoing comedy strip that held the feature place, and then bit by bit they started adding superheroes and eventually military stories to the comic until it just became straight up heroic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, you have more than a couple from that series.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Music Master is also from Heroic, and Mano Metal should also be. That's such a good character. Should also be from Heroic.
Okay. Now, when we get to the Silver Age, we're getting to a point where many of your readers will start to recognize these characters from their own childhood.
Yes, absolutely.
And, there's some here that we even recognize today. So, for instance, Brain Boy had a recent comeback about a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Fred Bedlente who brought him back for a while with Dark Horse. I was curious, did you know that Brain Boy was going to be coming back when you were writing that part of the book?
I believe that it had just been announced as I started writing the book.
Oh, okay.
So there was some back and forth as to whether we were going to include that one, but I know I don't want to say that I was maybe not dooming the book, but I did notice that very much what I felt kept him from being a successful superhero in the 50s and 60s seemed to have been replicated in the 2015s, and I was curious to see if it was going to be any more successful this time around.
Yeah. How many issues did Brain Boy last?
Originally he might have gone as much as 15. He was around for a little while.
Okay. Yeah. Van Lente's didn't last for that long, but I thought it was pretty good.
It's a crowded market, and he's a very good writer. Mm-hmm. So it definitely had a lot going for it. But it's when you've got a crowded rack like we still have today, you have to have something really dynamic to show the character off. And Brain Boy is a character who has no costume. He doesn't really like being called by his superhero name. He doesn't have that same kind of colorful, extravagant, in-your-face quality that a lot of other characters might have. And so hard to pick him up, especially with younger readers who are going to be looking for something very dynamic.
Mm-hmm. And then another recognizable hero, I guess we can call this a hero, maybe not necessarily singular, from the Silver Age that's made its way into contemporary comics is Dial H for Hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they give Dial H another try every now and again. It's always interesting to see what they do, even if it's not always, I think, spot on successful.
Yeah, the most recent Dial H, it wasn't in that initial wave of DC's New 52, but
I think it was a second wave.
It was a second, third, I can't remember, but I know it was a subsequent one, and it ran for, was it something like 14 or 15 issues? Mm-hmm. I thought it was okay. I thought it had the potential to be better than it was. I mean, personally, I thought that if they were going to bring back Dial H for Hero, they shouldn't have done it within the DC universe, which I guess makes sense. But for me, it's a much better fit with Vertigo.
Sure, or even just in a universe with no heroes. I think the version I enjoyed a lot was, and I'm probably getting this wrong, I think Will Pfeiffer was the writer. Came out in either the late 90s or the early 2000s, and obliquely characters like Superman were mentioned, but it was entirely just a chain of people finding the dial and getting sort of a monkey's paw effect out of it, where they would become a superhero, but in some way becoming a superhero turned out to kind of be the worst thing for them.
Yeah.
That one was a lot of fun because it was independent of... It didn't deal so much with heroes versus villains as it did with, man versus himself, one of those great premises of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, so that one was really fun. What are some of the heroes in the Silver Age that really stand out for you?
I do love myself some Brother Power the Geek.
Oh, I was hoping you'd say that.
I'm a big fan in general of Joe Simon's work. I find him exceptionally underrated, especially in terms of what he was apparently was attempting to do with his characters, which was to advocate for the power and the vitality and the inherent goodness of youth. which is what Brother Power and then his later successor, Prez, both embrace.
And Prez makes an appearance in the book as well.
Prez, in fact, when I was first speaking with the publisher of Quirk Books, Prez was the one character he was desperate to make sure was in the book.
Now, see, that's interesting because of all of the characters that you profile in League of Regrettable Superheroes, Prez is the one that is really not a superhero.
Yeah, he doesn't have a lot of the traits. He doesn't have inherent powers. He does wear a distinctive costume, but it's sort of implied that that's a token of his office. But he has a motive. He has a rogues gallery. He has a really bizarre rogues gallery, and his solutions to a lot of problems are confrontational. So I think I can squeak him in under the superhero definition.
And why not?
And why not?
Yeah, it's your
and plus,
book.
he's so much fun, and I just really am so delighted by Prez that I would have hated to have not had him in.
And that's another one that we've seen come back. Now, have
Right.
you read the recent Prez series?
I hate to say this. I bailed on most mainstream comics a couple years ago. Mm-hmm. There was a point when I was thinking about, I think I'd gone a year without reading a real book because working on my blog and working on Regrettable Superheroes, I was reading almost nothing but comic books. And just about the same time that DC did its New 52 and Marvel did, I think it was called Marvel Now.
Yeah.
I just burned out, and I realized I needed to kind of pull back on comics a little bit. So I've read maybe 2 or 3 dozen comics from the big 2 companies in the last 3 or 4 years. So I've missed out on Prez. It's something I'm curious about because Ben Caldwell is one of my favorite cartoonists. So I'm looking forward to eventually, when they do a collection, perhaps catching up on it.
Yeah. Now, I haven't read the new series, but I have heard good things about it. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's been much of a hit with the readers.
That's a shame.
Yeah, but getting back to Joe Simon, one of the things that you point out in your entry for Brother Power the Geek is, he may empathize with youth experience, but he's not really adept at writing within that voice.
Oh golly, no. I mean, he and Jack Kirby were adults when they created Captain America in the 1940s. He and Jack are both in the army, almost promptly after creating him. So by the time he's doing Brother Power the Geek, it's been 20 years. He's middle-aged. He's very much writing like a middle-aged man. Trying his best to appeal to the kids. In a lot of ways, it's like looking at any advertising that was aimed at youth culture back in the 1960s, and it's very awkward and clumsy and doesn't really seem to have a grip on what the actual importance of the movement is. For instance, there are 2 hippies in the book, and whereas in the culture, hippies were looking on, by and large, because of course there's always outliers, but hippies were looking for a complete renovation and revitalization of staid and stagnant social constructs. And they were looking at new types of music, new types of theater. They were interested in an art form that was expressly from and about their generation. In Brother Power the Geek, the 2 hippies just don't like to have jobs, and they spend a lot of time sleeping. So Joe might have missed that particular boat. But with Brother Power the Geek, he created this super strong pacifist who really wanted to make something of himself and tried. He had the Pinocchio complex that's a fairly common trick in comic books. Red Tornado, Vision, these characters who were robots and desperately want to be human. But very often what those characters do is they sit around and mope about it. Brother Power desperately wanted to be human, so he got a job. And he went out and made friends, and he tried to stand for something and to give himself an identity, which is a much more interesting story than just, crying about it.
Right. So what's another Silver Age hero that stands out for you?
There's a few that I think are interesting despite themselves. Buona Beast is a character that I know has had some recent success. in the Batman Brave and the Bold cartoon. But they made him successful by really drastically changing his origin, because this is a character whose co-creator walked off the book because he was afraid it was too racist. So, and he's not necessarily wrong, to be honest. Whatever, the best intentions were being made in creating Buona Beast, but it's a very patronizing character. It's based off some really colonial ideas about African culture. Even though it was trying its best, it couldn't escape from, like, culturally the institutionalized racism that defined how we viewed an entire continent. So he's interesting that it's done with the best intentions, but the execution, maybe not so good.
You point out something similar elsewhere in the book. I'm thinking of your modern age entry for New Guardians. Maybe the good intentions were there, but the way that these characters, various ethnicities, nationalities were represented, not very nice.
I think one of the lessons you learn with comic books is there's obviously, and it's nice to see it getting better, but there's obviously always been a problem with gender and ethnicity representation in the books. And if you want to fix that problem, don't do it all at once. Don't just create a book with 10 ethnic minority characters in it and expect there the problem solved, especially when the creators are the same white male creators who've been creating for 25 years. Because what they're going to bring to it, even with the best intentions, is a lot of stereotypes and assumptions that they've never had challenged before. And you're going to get things like, you have a Japanese superhero. Well, of course he's really into computers. And you have a Chinese superheroine, and of course she's dragon based. And you've got a Jamaican superheroine, and she says I and I a lot.
Yeah.
It's always going to be at best uncomfortable and at worst really offensive.
Yeah, they're better off sticking with someone like this is another entry in the Silver Age, Fat Man the Human Flying Saucer. Now, I know that, for those who are a little weight challenged, if we can put it that way, this may be a little offensive, but there's something I guess less off-putting about this character, because as you point out, Fat Man the Human Flying Saucer is in many ways a response to Batman's 66 camp craze.
There is that. He's definitely meant to be campy. Since its creators had been involved with Captain Marvel, they were trying to kind of appeal to the errant Captain Marvel audience that must have still been out there. But I just talked about this a couple of days ago on social media with someone who was asking about Fat Man. The weird thing about him is he's actually a very fat positive character. Despite being overweight and inexplicably having his, endomorphism reflected in his name, he's a very athletic character. He likes to go jogging. He works out constantly. He's portrayed as being quick, agile, and strong. He just also really loves giant meals. So he ends up being a fat guy who's quite a fighter, quite a runner, just all around quite a healthy, happy individual.
Plus, he turns into a flying saucer.
And he turns into a flying saucer, which is where I would have led with. I would have called that book The Human Flying Saucer. But Fat Man it is.
Yeah, and you were pointing out the creators were old hands in the comic industry. This is C.C. Beck and Otto Binder, the guys who were behind the original Captain Marvel, Shazam. I still prefer to refer to him as Captain Marvel.
Sure.
But, despite Marvel Comics. But I think it's great that you point out that Fat Man the Human Flying Saucer, his getup looks curiously like the Big Cheese.
Very similar. And probably I would suggest that's one of the reasons that they went and made him portly, is because if they'd had another big, bulky, well-fit fella, even in a green Captain Marvel costume, that probably would have brought the very litigious DC comics down on them.
Right. Well, what's a third favorite of yours from the Silver Age?
Ooh, let me. I have the book in front of me. I'm going to flip through real quick. I'm sort of tempted to say Gunmaster, because this is an avowed pacifist who wants nothing to do with violence. And in order to make sure that there is no violence, he invents increasingly more dangerous guns and uses them against his enemies, and even picks up a sidekick whose name is Bullet, the gun boy. And
I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this book. And the best entries, the ones with the heroes that stand out, at least for me, are not necessarily the ones that look the most ridiculous, but like, for instance, the Eye, even though that is very ridiculous and is one of my favorites, but it's the premise that is so absurd and makes you wonder who was thinking of what when they created this idea. And I think Gunmaster is one of these. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And as the book goes on, there's less and less lip service given to his pacifism, because how could you? How could you continue to argue this is a guy who doesn't like violence when he's literally adding to his arsenal every day?
Right. Thank you, Dick Giordano. Thank you, Charlton Comics.
I feel like, and of course, that example is played out a second time a little more successfully with another Charlton Comics character, the Peacemaker.
Yeah.
But the Peacemaker actually is working on a global scale, and he's targeting things like rogue nations or dictators. So he's limiting violence to the institutions and people most likely to cause violence, as opposed to Gunmaster merely responding to violence.
Right.
So sometimes it can work.
And before we leave the Silver Age, I just want to point out that you're not afraid to take on well-established heroes, because someone may be surprised to find Blackhawks in your book, but this is not just the Blackhawks. It's the new look Blackhawks.
Very specific era of a well-respected super team. There's a brief period when the Blackhawks had suffered since the military books were dying, which is slightly ironic because that's entirely the reason DC Comics bought the Blackhawks, was because they were a successful military book. So the effort came down to trying to turn them into superheroes, which did not work. It was too all over the map. The costumes and the identities seemed very arbitrary, I think is a fair way of saying it.
Right.
I think I'm trying to remember Chop, who was an offensive, a terribly offensive stereotype for the vast majority of his time in the comics, was reinvented as a tuxedo-wearing martial artist with steel hands who called himself Dr. Hands.
Yeah, that's better than the stereotype.
I guess. I feel like there's probably a better middle ground somewhere. He's not, even though he's not the worst of them. That would be Chuck, who becomes the listener and has to wear a pair of footy pajamas covered with ears.
Oy.
That's the worst.
The indignity. Okay, so when we get to from the 1970s on, I think many readers may wonder, okay, so that's where the big challenge would be. It's easy to find these ridiculous, strange, regrettable examples of heroes from the Golden and Silver Age, but what could you find possibly in the modern age? But you find a lot.
I think I found a pretty good mix. I think the things you want to look for are non-mainstream companies, because there's always an indie boom going on at some point. So very often those are the folks either doing the most experimental stuff, or those are the folks who don't have the professional chops, and so their work is coming out, we'll say, enthusiastic if not competently. And then the modern age has really been typified by marketing and licensing. So it's a good idea to sort of see what doesn't fit in that crossover between a licensed product and the concept of a superhero. Mm-hmm. I really wish this book had come out 2 years later, because I could have included Captain Citrus, who is a superhero who recently fought alongside the Avengers to promote the healthy vitamin C packed goodness of Florida orange juice. and likewise, I believe DC Comics just had the Justice League face off against an evil Colonel Sanders from an alternate Earth.
Oy.
Those are fun. Those are good, bizarre ideas.
You know, and you're right to point out that some of the heroes that are the weirdest in the modern age section are from smaller independent publishers. I don't know, for my money, the ones that are the most laughable actually do come from the big two, especially Marvel. And I'm thinking in particular of Adam X, the Extreme, and especially NFL Super Pro. I mean, you know, it's like, why? I mean, I know why, but
the why
hurts
doesn't
me
help,
nonetheless.
does it?
Exactly. It's painful.
I love that NFL, this has never been admitted more bald-facedly, but NFL Super Pro being created so the creator could get free NFL tickets. That is almost admirable in his honesty.
Yeah.
But Adam X, I think, is the one from the modern age that everyone zeroes in on, because we can remember leaving the 90s and looking back and seeing culturally what did and didn't work. And Adam X just seems to be a collection of everything from the 90s we wish wasn't around anymore. He's the Smash Mouth of superheroes.
You know, but we also, you know, throughout the book, you do highlight a number of legends. And, you know, we've talked already about Siegel and Schuster, and, you know, Jack Kirby gets some love in this book. But in the modern age, one of the heroes that stands out is Steve Ditko's Killjoy.
Right.
And I'm curious, have you read any or many of Ditko's independently published books that come out every now and again?
Back in college specifically, my peer group was obsessed with the independent work of Steve Ditko. So we used to hand that off back and forth. We had collections of his, I believe, Tales of Mysterious Suspense, which was where The Question had his first solo issue, and all the Blue Beetles he did. We're huge fans of Steve Ditko's. I was trying not to say libertarian, absolutist superheroes, or Randian superheroes. I haven't read a lot of them recently. I know he's still producing. I may be wrong in just assuming that it probably isn't much different from what he was writing 10 or 20 years earlier.
That's why I asked the question. In fact, recently, I think it was 2 months ago, my co-host Andy Konka and I did an episode where we look at most of his independent stuff from the past few years, his, Ditko Presents or Ditko Act, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, up until the most contemporary stuff. And the kind of hero that you find in Killjoy is exactly the same kind of hero that we see, of course, with, Mr. A, and then any number of other characters, heroic or otherwise, that he creates. It's the same tone, the same message. So that's why I was curious if you were familiar with his self-published stuff, because if you had included self-published comics as a possibility for inclusion in this book, then I think a good quarter of League of Regrettable Superheroes could be dedicated to the Ditko characters in those.
I will tell you that if I remember correctly, Mr. A was on the list. If for no other reason than his steel mask, which clearly would have killed a man. Mr. A was on the list, Static was on the list, and The Missing Man, which I don't think he ever even completed. And that may have been a Jerry Conway collaboration. But Ditko's an interesting creator, not just because of his fairly unchanging, inflexible political views, but because he pairs them with one of the most imaginative visual vocabularies in comics. Just from the way he'll lay out a panel to the way he'll extremize a figure who is in an impossible acrobatic pose, to the truly bizarre Doctor Strange backgrounds, or the figure of the missing man. This was a character who was a smile, a pair of glasses, some hair, and arms and legs. So he's a fascinating creator. I almost feel we try to keep it down to one of his creations, one of his distinct creations, because you're right, we would end up talking probably a little too much about the same topics. But I picked Killjoy because that's the one that, by being more tongue-in-cheek than the average Steve Ditko, has the feel of like a Gilbert and Sullivan opera to me. It doesn't feel quite like, say, his turn on The Question, which was very, very dependent on lecturing. And the hero would literally just stand and lecture criminals who were dying on why they didn't deserve to be saved. As opposed to Killjoy, where there's an endless roster of colorful characters saying absurd things like knuckles should be outlawed on some people as they're getting punched in the face. That it seemed like more fun.
Or I have the right to rob.
I have the right to rob. And lawyers' heart and soul marching around the outside of this, constantly protesting for the rights of criminals, and that decent people should be thrown in jail because it's criminals' turn to be outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ditko's world is, let's just say, a little challenging to grapple with.
It is. It's one of my favorite things is when you have a creator whose work is simultaneously essential to the medium and dynamic and experimental and exciting, and then personally speaking, really hard to get along with. So you have to kind of rationalize those two things as you dive into them.
What are some of your other favorites from the modern age?
I have one that whenever I think of the modern age, I do always think of this one that I hate. It is just a character that absolutely, it's the only character in the book that rubs me the wrong way. And that's Sonic, the very 1980s superhero, ghetto superhero who fights crime with an amped up Walkman. And it's partly because he's so tied into the era. Even if he had like a pocket MP3 player, that would still seem outdated. And he's a duplicate, effectively, of Black Lightning. There's almost nothing in his origin or story that doesn't feel like it came out of the Black Lightning comic of 20 years earlier. And it's a very patronizing, condescending take on black communities, on urban black communities, which we don't need any more of. And it was a shame to see a mid-1980s comic in the age of, The Cosby Show and Michael Jackson, when or Michael Jordan, when you were seeing African Americans gaining a lot of prominence in the pop culture mindset, to have this character who is a real throwback to the way African American superheroes were presented 10, 15 years earlier.
Yeah.
So he's one of my least favorites. I do love Gunfire, who is a superhero whose power is that anything he touches turns into a gun. And it's well worth mentioning it took frequently vulgar Irish comic creator Garth Ennis to take that to its natural conclusion, which is that he accidentally touches his own butt and turns it into a hand grenade. And I'm sure, and he asked the question that I know I asked when Gunfire was introduced, and I think everybody asked when Gunfire was introduced, how does he pee?
Yeah.
Unless he's turning his own penis into a gun.
And there are a lot of places we could go from that premise.
That is very true, that I hope we don't.
Yeah. One of my favorites, just because I think that it's just so ridiculous. And again, we come back to Marvel, and that is US1.
That's a fun book, though.
In fact, that's the very last entry in,
yes, it is.
in Regrettable Superheroes.
It's just a surprisingly fun book. It's another one that was created by licensing. In fact, I have the ads for the US1 playset, but it fell through pretty quickly, and having the license and having a book publishing and not wanting to just cancel a book and lose the distribution spot, because it was very different before the direct market, they kept it going for as long as they could. And they did 12 issues of what amounted to, I think, the Wacky Races crossed over with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Maybe meets The Last Starfighter.
Yeah, see, the thing about this, and this came out in about May of 1983. It was the first issue. By that point, I had really, outside of Mad Magazine, quit reading comics. This is when I was in, undergraduate school, and I just lost touch with this. But in going, so I wasn't familiar with US 1 originally, but going back through this, it just strikes me that this is an example of Marvel, and you also mentioned the merchandising as well, really being extremely slow on the uptake. I mean, where was this in the mid-1970s when CB radios were all the craze?
Yeah, that seemed to be where it belonged. I don't think trucking was a big deal in the 80s. That kind of died out with Convoy.
Exactly. I mean, it would be great to have seen this during the 1970s, and you can have a character in the book that looked a little bit maybe like C.W. McCall.
Sure. Yeah, it would definitely seem to have fit in a different era, but unfortunately, that's just how comics work now that they're corporate, because you can't jump on a trend when it's still hot. Like I say, I've not read a lot of the modern comics coming out of DC and Marvel, but I do remember that they decided to basically create an Occupy Wall Street comic. Trying to remember the name of it. I believe Gail Simone was the writer.
Oh, and it was paired with a new incarnation of the Green Team.
Of the Green Team, right.
Yeah, it was, oh God, I read the first issue of that and now I'm blanking. And I'm sure our listeners are hitting their iPods or their phones or whatever device they're listening to, saying yes.
But it was and that was a movement that still around, but its prominence in the media was gone for about 3 months before that book came out.
Right.
So it was just a case of, I'm sure during the pitch meetings they were saying we have to jump on this and get it out now. Well, it takes 6 months to write and draw a comic. And it takes time for that to get the marketing boys involved and to run it past your boss or your publisher, make sure that it's not somehow interfering with the company and corporate interests. And by the time you're done with all that, it's not going to be part of the zeitgeist anymore.
The Movement, that was the title.
Yeah, The Movement, that's
yes.
it.
So now you've mentioned a few times during our conversation that there were heroes that you had wanted or considered including in this book. Mm-hmm. And this may be actually one of the most interesting questions of our conversation, and that is, what other characters did not get in?
There was a long, I guess I'll call it an argument, with my editor, Rick Chillett, about including the Doom Patrol. And I really wanted to put them in because they are some of my favorite superheroes.
Oh, yeah.
They are, I think, I really wanted to celebrate them, basically. Premiani and Drake created really one of the best dysfunctional families in comics. Some of the wildest villains. And the team was literally made up by its charter of screwed up people who didn't get along. And I thought that was an interesting tack to take. But they're highly popular and they've never been out of print for a very long time. And it was hard to justify putting the Doom Patrol in next to characters like Fat Man, the Human Flying Saucer.
Right. Although you do have something similar with Wally Wood's Miracles, Inc.
Yeah, I think that was the trade-off. Especially because that is another great comic, very, very fun and readable, and just jammed in the back of a Harvey Thriller book, so its chance for survival was nil. Like the Harvey Thriller books didn't even succeed.
Okay, so what other regrets do you have that you couldn't include in Regrettable Superheroes?
Let's see, I had wanted to tackle the Lieutenant Marvels, who were Captain Marvel's, and I hate to use these words, but dumb, hick, and tall friends who also had his superpowers. I don't know why tall was somehow a characteristic worth mentioning, or fat for that matter. There was one from, they were all named Billy Batson. They all also had the power of Shazam for no reason. One of them was from Brooklyn, and he was stocky, so they called him Fat Marvel. Another one was just very tall. They called him Tall Marvel. And one was from the South, so they called him Hill Marvel, as in hillbilly. That's just insulting. There was that.
Actually, I'm from the South. I don't find that too insulting.
You don't mind? You wouldn't mind being called Hill Derek?
Well, I knew a lot of people who I wouldn't think twice about calling hillbillies, even though they've been nowhere near hills.
Fair enough.
Yes, and coming from a Southerner, okay, it's fine.
Okay, good to know. There was also another character from Otto Binder, and I can't remember who did the art, but it came out of the same company in the same time as Fat Man the Human Flying Saucer, and that was Todd Holton, Super Green Beret. And he was basically a Captain Marvel character. He was a young boy who could turn into a full-grown, superpowered superhero thanks to an old wizard basically giving him a magic green beret. Actually, Green Beret was given to an actual Green Beret soldier, but he handed it off to the young boy. And so it was a paramilitary Captain Marvel.
Now, did this come out, that title come out at around the same time, let's say the mid to late 60s?
Peak of the Vietnam War. Came out of the peak of the Vietnam conflict.
And the reason I ask about that is because the Sergeant Barry Sadler who sang that song, there was a whole series of songs that were Green Beret this or Green Beret that, or had a similar feel to it. And so that is maybe a cultural phenomena of the 1960s that you don't hear about near as much as, let's say, the James Bond craze of the 1960s.
Yeah, I was not aware that there had been I'd always heard Ballad of the Green Berets as being sort of a one-off. I was not aware that there was an entire genre of it.
And I don't know if I would go as far to say a genre of this, but the reason I mention this is several years ago, and I can't remember who the company was, that put out an incredible box set of CDs. And now it even sounds antiquated to say CDs.
CDs, right.
But it's called Next Stop is Vietnam. And it's, I can't remember how many discs, but many, 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 that has music that begins in the early 1960s, and you even have music into the 70s that has something to do with the war. It could be the anti-war movement or even the pro-war movement. Mm-hmm. And on that collection are a number of songs about Green Berets, Marines, things of the sort. And even if they don't mention Green Beret, they have a very similar sound to the famous Ballad of the Green Berets. And so there was kind of a flurry within the musical world of trying to jump on, of those kind of songs jumping on Sadler's bandwagon.
Interesting. This certainly must have been part of it.
Yeah.
Or failing that, from the John Wayne movie.
Yeah. And that fed into it as well.
I think it was a weird fit for comic books because, the 1940s comics had been very gung-ho about opposing the Axis in all its forms. But by the late 60s and 70s, it didn't embrace a pro-militaristic stance like it had a generation earlier.
Right. And it really wasn't until the very early 80s that you had a comic that actually acknowledged the Vietnam War in its title. The Nam.
The Nam, yeah.
Yeah, and wasn't that very early 80s?
I think I'm going to, because that was definitely an Epic Comics release, so I'm going to suggest anywhere from 81 to 83.
Yeah, that sounds right.
But that was about when we started to talk about Vietnam in any stretch whatsoever, because a lot of villains would show up who were sympathetic because they had been soldiers in Vietnam and either had been changed or injured in Vietnam and had come home to find a lack of support and had therefore turned to crime. I remember, too, Mike Barron's The Badger. I believe Norbert Sykes, the main character, that was a Vietnam vet, as was Riley, his partner. So, yeah, that's really where that starts becoming a real fixture in comics a solid 10 years after we finally moved out of LA, or LA, Vietnam.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I want to underscore that that makes this book so damn enjoyable is the humor. And, to me, it seems that given the premise and given the number of heroes and the kind of heroes that you and I have been discussing, it would seem that there would be the danger of the author falling prey to corny humor, puns, and whatnot. In other words, every other joke, the reader may roll her or his eyes. That's not the case in League of Regrettable Heroes. To me, one of the things that really stood out is not so much the heroes themselves and the way you write about them, but the tone, the humor. I think you do a great job with pointing out the ridiculousness without being obvious about it. Sometimes your humor is subtle. For instance, the aforementioned rainbow-colored fonts with Rainbow Boy entry. Little things like that. And that's one of the reasons why in reading this, as my family can attest, I laughed out loud quite a number of times.
Well, thank you. That's good to hear.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that the League of Regrettable Superheroes made me think about, and I wanted to run this by you and see what you thought of it. I mentioned earlier that not quite half of the book is devoted to Golden Age heroes that are a little strange or regrettable. And, part of the reason, as you said, is, it was a new genre at the time and people are trying new things. And so much more wackiness ensued. Mm-hmm. But also, given our contemporary sensibilities, okay, we would be more apt to see some of these earlier heroes as ridiculous.
Sure.
But to me, it's the modern stuff that seems more ridiculous by comparison. And it's what they say about the frog in boiling water, okay? That you put a frog in a pan of water and then you slowly heat it. The frog is not going to sense a change in temperature enough to where it'll want to jump out. And so it ends up getting boiled alive because it just incrementally gets used to the temperature. I see that in similar ways to the contemporary superhero reader, in that people who are, and I love superhero comics, don't get me wrong. We don't talk about them on the Comics Alternative, but there is something really ridiculous about what especially DC and Marvel are doing right now. Not so much the heroes themselves, but let's say the relaunches or the death and the rebirth of this and that, and just the shenanigans that go on over and over again. And I get the sense that readers who are really invested in contemporary superhero comics just get it so much. It's a barrage of this ridiculousness that they get used to it. And so every time that Marvel and DC, and I think especially Marvel, kind of turns up the knob of strangeness and weirdness and unbelievability, past 10 and 11, they say, not that big of a deal.
Yeah, I was actually chatting with some friends about that last night. A friend of a friend apparently had been buying every Spider-Man comic that had ever come out since he was a teenager. In his 40s now, he didn't read them. They were just going in the collection. So he was accepting whatever they were selling without even judging the contents of it, which I think that's an extreme scenario. I'm sure most people who buy comics still read them, but that's about what's happening, is you just learn to accept whatever it is they hand your way.
Now, what happened a few months ago with Loot Crate? My family subscribes to Loot Crate, and it was not long after you and I got in touch with one another about doing this interview that I opened that month's Loot Crate, and lo and behold, a smaller version of the League of Regrettable Superheroes.
A little tiny baby version, yeah. I was very excited to hear that. I believe this was the first book that Loot Crate ever included in any of its series. So that's our claim to fame.
Well, how did that come about?
That was entirely at the Quirk Books offices. Those fine folks out there doing right by me. I found out about it probably about 6 weeks before the crate debuted, and then was promptly sworn to secrecy because they do keep the contents of the book very, very private, or contents of the crate very private. So I didn't even get to see a copy of it until I got my Loot Crate.
Well, how is the baby version different outside of size from the adult version of the book?
Well, let's not call it the adult version.
Well, especially if, we got, Gunman.
Full frontal nudity.
Yeah.
No, it's about half the entries. I think there's 50 entries. My editor got to pick them, and I think out of sheer cussedness, he made sure that the characters that people most often yell at me about were definitely in the Loot Crate book, so that I could get a lot more emails about putting ROM in the League of Regrettable Superheroes. But yeah, I believe that's the only change. It's it's half the entries. I think a little less than half the art, just to fit the page count, and a brand new cover designed by Timothy O'Donnell over at Quirk Books.
And unless I'm forgetting something, you now are the first guest that we've had on the Comics Alternative podcast to have something included in Loot Crate.
Well, all right.
So congratulations.
Thank you very much. I'll take that with me to my grave.
Yeah, the award is in the mail. So now, have you seen you or the publisher seen any uptick in sales since the Loot Crate?
Yeah, the Loot Crate, of course, the Loot Crate itself was pretty significant, but apparently it did spread some awareness of the book, which I'm very grateful for.
And, that's one of the things I'm hoping that this interview will do, is to spread additional awareness of this, because as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, I mean, this would be the perfect gift for a friend who has an interest in comics, pop culture, or just humor and fun.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And you're right. And people should definitely buy these for Christmas gifts.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we go, I want to ask you about your own podcast, because we haven't even touched upon that.
Sure.
You are a podcaster, but you devote your show to something completely different from comic books.
Yeah, I am a longtime fan of 1970s detective television show Columbo. One of my friends, RJ White, who lives over in Philadelphia, other side of the country, also a fan. We had worked on RJ's previous podcast, Wasted Words, for a little bit, and somehow got the idea together to start doing a Columbo podcast. So I think we've got 32 episodes up on the site now, which is about half of every Columbo episode ever produced. We cover one episode per podcast. We invite a special guest on to talk Columbo with us, and it's a blast.
So do you have, let's say, a finite number of episodes, given that each show or each episode of your podcast is devoted to one episode of the original Columbo?
Yeah, I think there's 69 total episodes of Columbo, including the specials that were produced in the 80s and 90s. We've fudged the numbers a little bit by covering at least one episode of Mrs. Columbo, a non-canonic spin-off created by NBC and starring Kate Mulgrew of Deep Space Nine.
Oh, I remember that.
Orange is the New Black. It's a strange show. The temptation is always to say it's not good, but it is good. It's just a really bad Columbo show. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're about halfway through now, and we'll probably be wrapping up in about another year and a half, because we do take kind of a lackadaisical approach to it.
And how often does it come out?
We try for every 2 weeks. We slow down around the holidays. I think we're aiming right now to record one more episode to do our Christmas special, and then we'll probably take a couple weeks off. But if folks are interested, we're at jomtpodcast.com, and you can listen to them all there. We're also on iTunes and all your other favorite podcast listening services.
In addition to the location of your podcast, which is titled Just One More Thing. Mm-hmm. Is there any other way that our listeners can contact you to find out about your work and, more importantly, about the League of Regrettable Superheroes?
Well, I'll tell you, you can find League of Regrettable Superheroes on the Quirk Books website. And of course on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and anywhere else that sells books, like a bookstore or a magical tree. If that magical tree happens to focus on books. As for me, you can find me at my website, calamityjohnsave.us. You can find me on Twitter as Calamity John, on Tumblr as Calamity John, and Facebook as Calamity John. And I think pets.com, Ask Jeeves, IMDb, and maybe Ashley Madison. You can pretty much find me everywhere under the name Calamity John. There's right now the front page of my website has a listing to all the interviews and reviews of League of Regrettable Superheroes. So if you're really on the fence about it, I literally have 30, maybe 35 different arguments to convince you to try to pick it up.
Okay, well, we'll include links over to your website and also for links for people to get their copy of League of Regrettable Superheroes on Amazon. So, John, I want to thank you again for the conversation. I had a great time, almost as much fun as reading the book, but the reason that the book was more enjoyable is because it's really damn funny. And
you can read it on the toilet. So that's the other thing.
That's true. And I can tell you right now, I'm not doing that as I'm podcasting.
Right. So it's never going to be as much fun.
Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you so very much.
So that was a good time. John has a great sense of humor. It definitely comes out in his book, and I can certainly sense that in our conversation.
Yeah, well, that was a lot of fun to listen to. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, it's the League of Regrettable Superheroes from Quirk Books. It makes a great gift. And in fact, if you head on over to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service, you'll see that you can get this book at 30% off of the cover price. So you would only pay $17.47 to get a lot of fun between two hardcovers.
That's a pretty good deal.
Yes. You can also get this at Amazon.com, but if you do choose to get it at Amazon, then go to our website or the webpage, comicsalternative.com/Amazon, click on that image that says get your Amazon stuff here, and whatever you get through that click-through, we'll get a few cents thrown to us, and that's good. Take away money from Jeff Bezos and give it to the two guys with PhDs.
That's right. We need it.
Exactly. And after you do get your comics at either Amazon or Discount Comic Book Service, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can send us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. But you can also call us on the phone. The number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want the latest news with what's going on with the Comics Alternative, hop on to Twitter and check out at the number 2 guys with PhDs. You'll see everything that we're up to, and you can retweet our tweets, which we certainly appreciate.
That's right. You can also email us. We're 2guys at comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly at Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Andy?
I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. We also have a YouTube channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us also on TuneIn. And you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. So check us out. Let us know how we're doing.
Yeah, and also, when you pick up and read the League of Regrettable Superheroes, send us an email and let us know what you think of it. You won't be disappointed.
That's right.
Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
See you later.